In 1927, the Carl D. Bradley launched as the longest freighter on the Great Lakes, earning the crown Queen of the Lakes. But Captain Roland Bryan sailed her out for one last load anyway, past the hull damage nobody reported, into a storm no one thought would matter. By the end, you'll know exactly what U.S. Steel deferred and why the survivors were right the whole time. The same aging hull gamble is happening right now on Lake Superior, on freighters decades past their prime. Go back to November 18, 1958. Bryan stands in the pilot house as the barometer collapses over Lake Michigan. The wind is already past hurricane force. The ship is riding heavy, empty, in ballast, and for a while she takes it the way she's taken every storm for 31 years. Then at around 5:30 in the evening, something changes. A sound moves through the hull. The stern sags. First Mate Elmer Fleming grabs the radio and sends 3 maydays, giving the ship's position while there's still time to give it. Bryan sounds the general alarm and blows the whistle for abandoned ship. Within minutes, the ship that once held every size record on the Great Lakes has broken into 2 pieces and is gone. For decades, the official story was simple: a freak November storm on Lake Michigan. An act of God. No ship could have survived it. And here's the thing, that explanation is not wrong. The wind was real, the waves were real, but it's too small. It doesn't explain why this specific ship, on this specific voyage, had a documented history of damage nobody had bothered to report. It doesn't explain why the captain had written home weeks earlier that the hull is not good and that he had to nurse her along. A storm doesn't choose which ship breaks in half and which one doesn't. Something else decides that, and to understand what that something else was, you have to go back to a version of this story that has nothing to do with a shipwreck at all. It starts with Limestone. In 1912, a company called Bradley Transportation was formed to solve one unglamorous, extremely specific problem. How do you move enormous quantities of crushed limestone from a quarry in northern Michigan to the steel mills that need it hundreds of miles away, reliably, year after year, without the whole operation grinding to a halt? The quarry itself, at a town called Rogers City, was one of the largest limestone operations anywhere, a literal hole in the ground miles wide, feeding the steel industry that was building the 20th century. Limestone isn't glamorous cargo. Nobody names a movie after a rock quarry. But steel doesn't get made without it, and in the 1910s, moving it efficiently across the Great Lakes was a genuine, expensive, unsolved logistics problem. Bradley Transportation's answer was simple: build ships specifically for this job, run them constantly, and make the whole supply chain depend on them. Which brings us to the twist most people miss about this story. Everyone who hears about the Carl D. Bradley assumes they're getting a shipwreck story. They're not. Not really. This is a company town story. Rogers City wasn't just where the quarry happened to be, it was built around the quarry and the fleet that served it. The men who crewed the Bradley weren't hired from some distant labor pool. They were the town. Neighbors, brothers, fathers and sons, living a few blocks from each other, coming home between voyages, raising families around a schedule set by a single company's shipping needs. When you understand that, the sinking stops being a maritime accident and starts being something closer to a town handing its own future to one piece of machinery, year after year, without really noticing it was doing that. To feel why that made sense at the time, you have to picture Great Lakes freight in the first half of the 20th century the way the people living it actually saw it, not as history, but as infrastructure nobody questioned. Steel mills ran on a rhythm dictated by iron ore and limestone arriving on schedule. Ships were floating factories, massive and loud, crewed by men who spent months at a time away from home and treated the lake like a job site, not a postcard. And in that world, size was status. A bigger ship meant more cargo per trip, which meant more efficiency, which meant the company that owned the biggest ship on the lakes had a real, tangible advantage. That's exactly what Bradley Transportation built. When the Carl D. Bradley launched in 1927 at 639 feet, she wasn't just a big boat. She was proof that this particular company could outbuild, outcarry, and outlast everyone else on the water. And for a long time, that's exactly what she did. In 1929, she carried a single cargo of over 18,000 tons of limestone, a load so large that moving the equivalent by rail would have taken roughly 300 freight cars. That's not a decorative statistic. That's the entire business case for the ship in one number. One trip across the lake could replace an enormous train, over and over indefinitely. In 1943, she became the first freighter to pass through the newly built MacArthur Lock at Sault Ste. Marie. Another first, another headline, another reminder that this ship was where the industry was heading. For 3 decades, she ran that quarry-to-mill route almost without pause, becoming not just the flagship of the fleet, but something closer to a local institution. Rogers City didn't just watch the Bradley succeed. Rogers City's economy was built on the assumption that she would keep succeeding. That sounds like a stable business. It wasn't, not underneath. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the shorter versions of this story. The entire post-war Great Lakes shipping industry was operating with a structural blind spot nobody had fully reckoned with. Ships built before 1948, the Bradley included, were constructed with a type of steel that engineers now understand becomes brittle and notch-sensitive with age and stress, meaning that instead of bending under pressure the way modern hull steel does, it can crack and fail suddenly. Nobody was ignoring safety on purpose. The inspection regime of the era simply wasn't built to catch that kind of fatigue. The Coast Guard inspected the Bradley in April of 1958 and again in October, weeks before she sank, and both times she passed. On paper, she was seaworthy. The problem wasn't a paperwork failure. The problem was that the entire framework for judging a ship's safety hadn't caught up to what 3 decades of hard use does to a hull built the way hers was. Which brings us to the part of this story that most retellings skip entirely, and it's the part that actually explains what happened. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume the failure started the night of the storm. It didn't. It started at least a year earlier, quietly, inside a run of ordinary bad luck that nobody treated as a warning. In April of 1957, the Bradley collided with another vessel, the White Rose, on the St. Clair River. She went into dry dock for major hull repairs, not routine maintenance, but a significant fix to a significant impact. Crewmen who worked her joked, half seriously, that she was held together by rust. That's not a line from a documentary script. That's what the men who sailed her were actually saying to each other. Then in 1958 alone, she ran aground near Cedarville, not once, but twice, and neither grounding was formally reported to the Coast Guard. Brian, in private letters home, wrote plainly that the hull is not good and that he had to nurse her along. That is a captain, in his own words, describing a ship he no longer fully trusted, months before he sailed her into the storm that killed him. So why keep sailing her? This is where the reversal at the center of this whole story actually lives. The Bradley wasn't neglected because nobody cared about her. She was neglected, in a sense, because everybody trusted her too much. She had 31 years of reliable service behind her. She was the flagship. She was the ship that had never let the company down. U.S. Steel had a plan to give her an $800,000 rebuild of her cargo hold and bulkheads, a real, budgeted, serious repair, but it was scheduled for the winter layup that hadn't started yet. The thinking wasn't reckless in an obvious way. It was the quiet, ordinary logic of, she's handled everything so far, she can handle one more trip. That is exactly the trap. The trust the Bradley had earned over 3 decades is the reason nobody pulled her from service in time. Being the most proven ship in the fleet is what got her sent out one more time instead of getting the repairs she needed first. That's the decision this video promised to show you. Not a single reckless order from a single villain, but a captain and a company both leaning on a ship's long, clean track record right up until the moment that record stopped meaning anything. Layer that onto everything else, and you can watch the walls close in one at a time. Start with the steel itself, brittle by the standards we understand today, and already 3 decades old. Add the 1957 collision, repaired but never fully resolved. Add 2 more unreported groundings in 1958, each one adding stress nobody was tracking. Add a genuinely needed rebuild that had been pushed back by a full season because the shipping schedule didn't have room for it yet. Add a last-minute order after she'd already unloaded her final cargo of the season and started for winter layup, recalling her for one more limestone run before the ice set in. None of these alone sinks a ship. A strong hull survives a collision. A well-maintained ship survives a grounding. A delayed repair survives one more season if the ship holds together. But stack them, and you get a vessel that is one bad storm away from a failure nobody predicted, sailed by a captain who had every rational reason, based on everything he'd experienced, to believe she could take it. And then the storm hit, and the hull failed at exactly its weakest point. When the ship broke, she lost power almost immediately, which meant the radio's range dropped and rescue coordination got harder in the exact moment it mattered most. The Coast Guard cutter Sundew eventually located the survivors roughly 15 hours after the sinking in freezing water miles from where the ship had actually gone down. 4 men made it to the one life raft they could reach. 2 of them died from exposure before rescue arrived. Of the 35 crew aboard, 33 did not come home. Here's where the collapse stops being about a ship and starts being about a company's response to what it had just done. U.S. Steel commissioned its own survey of the wreck in 1959 using a mini-sub, and that survey concluded the ship was lying in one piece on the lake floor, a finding that, conveniently, supported an act of God defense and limited the company's legal exposure. The 2 survivors, Elmer Fleming and Frank Mays, said the opposite from the beginning. They'd watched her break apart on the surface with their own eyes. For decades, their account was treated as one version among several, disputed by the company that had the most to lose if they were believed. This is the part that still bothers me. It took until 1997, an ROV expedition sending cameras nearly 400 feet down, to confirm that the wreck lies in 2 separate pieces on the lake bottom, just as the survivors had said all along. That's not a footnote. That's the company's official version of events being contradicted by physical evidence nearly 40 years after the fact, while the 2 men who told the truth from day one had spent most of their lives being doubted. And the company itself didn't collapse the way you'd expect a business to collapse. There was no dramatic bankruptcy, no liquidation sale, no headline about a corporate implosion. Bradley Transportation simply got folded into U.S. Steel's broader Great Lakes fleet in 1967, and the name quietly stopped being used. No press conference announced it. No one declared the end of an era. The brand that had built an entire town's identity just wasn't there anymore, absorbed into a larger structure that had no reason to keep using it. Decades later, that fleet passed again, this time into Canadian National Railway's hands. The quarry at Rogers City still operates today, now under a different owner entirely, still shipping limestone, completely disconnected from the name that once defined it. The system that mattered, the actual limestone to steel supply chain, never disappeared. It just stopped needing the Bradley name to run. None of that changes what happened to the people who were actually there. 23 of the 35 men who died were residents of Rogers City. In a town that size, that's not a statistic spread thin across a region. That's a loss that touched nearly every family, every street, every pew at the funeral. 23 women were widowed in a single night. 53 children lost their fathers. The funeral for the recovered victims was held at St. Ignatius Catholic Church, and ships out on the lakes reportedly anchored in tribute while it happened. The Detroit News helped seed a disaster relief fund for the families. 10 families eventually sued U.S. Steel, and the company settled for $1.25 million, roughly double what it had initially offered, only after the survivors' case had already put real pressure on the company's version of events. A settlement check is not the same thing as an answer. It compensates a family. It doesn't tell them the truth. For that, Rogers City had to wait for a bell, literally. The ship's original bell was recovered by divers years later and replaced with a memorial bell engraved with the names of the men who didn't come home. It's tolled every year at the Great Lakes Lore Maritime Museum, a small, deliberate act of remembering that has now outlasted the company that built the ship, the executives who deferred her repairs, and the survey that tried to rewrite what happened to her. Frank Mays, the last living survivor, carried that story publicly for more than 60 years, until his death in 2021. Which means the man who watched the Bradley break apart in front of him outlived the company's official denial of that exact fact by decades. Step back from Rogers City, and the uncomfortable part is that none of this stayed in the past. The specific mechanism that sank the Carl D. Bradley, an aging hull, known damage, deferred maintenance, and a schedule that didn't leave room to wait, is not a historical curiosity. It's an active operating condition on the Great Lakes right now. In June of 2024, the freighter Michipicoten, a bulk carrier built in 1952, developed a 13-foot crack in her hull on Lake Superior and had to issue a mayday of her own. Investigators pointed toward fatigue and structural failure as the likely cause. No one died. But the pattern is the same pattern. A ship built decades ago, still working, still trusted because it's kept working so far. According to the Lake Carriers Association, the average age of a freighter on the Great Lakes today is somewhere around 50 years old. One of the oldest still in active service, built in 1942, spent nearly 4 months sidelined in 2025 for major repairs before she could sail again. These aren't retired vessels being sentimentally kept afloat. They're doing real, current commercial work, because building a new one costs far more than repairing an old one. And an old one that's never failed looks, from the outside, exactly like a safe one. That is precisely the logic that put the Bradley on the water on November 18, 1958. So what actually destroyed the Carl D. Bradley? Not the storm alone. The storm exposed a weakness that had been building for years and was never fully addressed. Not one villain either. Brian's own judgment was reviewed and ultimately not the official cause the Coast Guard settled on. What the evidence supports is more specific than either of those simple answers. A 31-year-old hull with real documented damage, a genuinely planned rebuild that had been pushed one season too far into the future, and a final voyage that only happened because a ship with a long record of reliability was trusted past the point where that trust was still earned. That's what U.S. Steel deferred, not just a repair, but the moment to admit the ship needed it. And that's why the survivors were right the whole time, because the company's own account of the wreck, the one that shaped how this story was told for nearly 40 years, turned out to be the version that wasn't true. Two men watched the Carl D. Bradley break in half on the surface of Lake Michigan. It took 39 years and a camera 400 feet down for anyone with the power to say so publicly to admit they were right. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the disasters that quietly rewrote how entire industries operate, and the companies that disappeared without anyone officially declaring it, subscribe. There's more of that here. If your family sailed the Great Lakes freighters, or you've ever stood on that dock in Rogers City, tell me, did they ever talk about the night the Bradley went down?